Hello there and welcome to The Value of Everything. I welcome Professor Richard Wolff. He is one of the most prominent Marxist economists in the world as we speak. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
So, first question on the agenda, I just want to ask you about cooperatives. So, how influential was Robert Owen on Karl Marx?
Well, Marx was an extraordinarily erudite and serious scholar. No doubt partly being an exile in England from his native Germany, he had time on his hands and he had not many distractions beyond those that bedevil refugees always. But he had a good friend in Frederick Engels who helped him financially. So he had the time to indulge the resources of the British Museum in London.
Yeah.
And he took advantage of that. And he studied anything and everything that he thought shed light on his central preoccupation. And that, I think, would best be described as follows. Karl Marx was a child of the French Revolution. Like most progressive European thinkers, for him, the French Revolution was a staggeringly important historical event. It was the rising up of the simple people, the average people, the ordinary people, against an oppressive elite regime, the Louis this and the Louis that. And the slogans it advanced, liberty, equality, and fraternity, were as good a summary of everything he believed in as anything. And so for him, as for so many of his generation, the French Revolution meant an era of human freedom, of democracy, the end of autocracy, of monarchy, of the oppression of the many by the few, which for them also was symbolized by feudalism. So to make a long story short, the French Revolution represented the overthrow of feudalism in favor of a new system, capitalism, which would usher in, as a necessary part of itself, a regime of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the simple problem was that by the time Marx reaches his maturity, it's 50 years after the French Revolution, and he looks around at his native Germany, at neighboring France, and eventually at England too, and he reaches the conclusion that, yes, capitalism has indeed replaced feudalism, but it never ushered in the promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. And so Marx's central preoccupation was to answer the question, why had that not happened? Why had the promise of capitalism not been delivered?
Yeah.
Why was capitalism not only not the means to realize liberty, equality, and fraternity, but how and why was it operating as an obstacle to realizing those humanistic goals?
Yeah.
And Robert Owen becomes important because that's part of the answer Marx fastens on, that the way of organizing production in a capitalist system, which has a tiny number of people sitting at the top of an enterprise, a corporation, a company.
Yeah.
This tiny group in a modern corporation, it's a board of directors elected by shareholders, but in earlier phases, it could be a family or a group of businessmen or women. They make all the decisions. They decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. And the vast majority of people who work in each enterprise are excluded from those decisions. And for Marx, again, to make a long discourse short, therein lay one of the fundamental flaws of capitalism. It had not overcome the absence of a democracy, of a community in the act of production. Just as in slavery, masters told the slaves what to do, and in feudalism, lords told the serfs what to do.
Yeah.
It turned out that capitalism had simply replaced master and lord with capitalist, and replaced slave and serf with proletarian, with employee, with worker, and therefore had replicated the old dichotomy of a tiny group making all the decisions and the mass having to live with them, rather than overcoming it. And therefore what Robert Owen and other experiments like that showed Marx was the way forward, the way finally to get a society that could at least try to embody liberty, equality, and fraternity was by revolutionizing the organization of the workplace. And that would mean replacing a capitalist, hierarchical, top-down enterprise structure with a worker co-op structure as one way to do that.
Thank you for that. So obviously there was a lot of influence, especially around like the 1800s, and there was a prominent friendly societies and cooperative businesses that emerged around that period.
Yes.
Why has that fell into decline, even though that would be quite advantageous for a majority of workers?
Well, the truth is, it hasn't declined particularly. There are many thousands of worker co-ops busy and active in England, for example, today. There are even more of a worker co-op sector to Italy than there is to Britain. The most famous worker co-op in the world is Spanish in the northern part of Spain, in the Basque territory. The truth of the matter is that worker co-ops have been a feature of the production organization of many societies around the world for centuries. Here in the United States, let me give you an example. One of the earliest efforts at this sort of an organization was undertaken by a denomination of the Protestant Christian Church, here known as the Shakers, very famous for remarkable furniture that they designed and made since the colonial times in the United States. And they organized their work processes as worker co-ops. None of the capitalist structure. They felt that Christianity, as they understood it and interpreted the Bible, etc., implied and indeed made imperative a cooperative community producing goods and services in a democratically structured way. I think the way I would rephrase your question is that in many periods of history, capitalism as a system, in the 300 years that it's been an ascending system in this country, has felt very threatened and challenged by the criticisms of capitalism mouthed by Marxists and socialists and anarchists and all kinds of other dissenting groups, but has also been equally frightened, if you like, by the concrete effort human beings have never stopped making to organize production in an explicitly and determinedly non-capitalist way as a worker co-op. And one way to handle that is to ideologically decree that it is not viable, that it can't work, that there's very few of them, that when they exist, they very quickly fall apart. There's a whole vast accumulated literature to represent the worker co-op as either hopeless, unrealizable, anachronistic, old-fashioned, and so on. But the reality is it has been remarkably persistent and often very successful.
Okay. I know we're moving a little bit off this subject, but I see there's a link here. There's a lot of tech external disruptors which are breaking through centralized monopolies. For example, Uber on taxi licenses, Bitcoin on fiat money, and we have crowdfunding becoming a major phenomenon. Do you see this as like the fledgling stages of dual power, a diarchy, where one side is centralist and the other is decentralized? Maybe even you could say to a certain extent cooperative.
Yes, I think there are a number of forces that are moving in that direction. I think politically, for example, Jeremy Corbyn in England, in Great Britain, has made it crystal clear that an explicit objective of the Labour Party in his country will be to develop and expand a worker cooperative sector alongside of the capitalist sector that will be explicitly funded, subsidized, and enlarged as a primary commitment of the government should the Labour Party win in that society. That's a remarkable movement in that direction.
Right.
There are these technological breakthroughs, but I'm a little less, how shall I put it, a little less optimistic about those, since it's clear to me that capitalism has for a long time been able to subordinate the potential, the liberational potential of technical breakthroughs and make them serve profit instead. And I see that with Uber, for example, very clearly. Of course, it could be the sharing economy that Uber's public relations efforts suggest that it is. But in fact, what Uber is doing is replicating a very old capitalist game. You know, taxi industry is a wonderful illustration. When the taxi industry begins, it's, of course, immediately subordinated to the capitalist system. In other words, the people, the companies that set up with automobiles and taxi drivers are trying to make a profit. And in order to make a profit, they have to limit their costs. And one way you limit the costs is you don't maintain the mechanical level of operation as you ought to. You cut corners on insurance in the event of accidents. You save money by hiring people who might not be of the quality and responsibility that you might otherwise want. And then, of course, you have the predictable accidents, breakdowns. And over time, the customer begins to complain that this capitalistically oriented enterprise risks life and limb. And what happens then, and it's happened to one industry after another, is that the government is called in. You set up a taxi commission. Every American city with a taxi fleet has one.
Yep.
And the government comes in and basically works out a compromise. Workers will be paid properly. The price of a taxi will go up accordingly so that the company can profit reasonably. In other words, you make sure that it takes care of the insurance and the mechanics. You compensate for what capitalism failed to do by means of government regulation and control. And then it's only a matter of time before somebody comes along and says, my goodness, if I could somehow cut some corners, given the nice high prices that these taxi rides now fetch, I could make a fortune. Uber uses technology to basically do that. Save on insurance, save on all the peripheral costs of these workers who are now no longer regularly employed, but contract laborers. It's a very old story, and it will be, by the way, replicating the same history. Eventually, the commissions will govern the Uber business, just as they had to come in and govern the taxi business in the first place. So my fear is technological breakthrough is usually manageable by capitalism. It's more likely going to be the case that the failures of capitalism that are now becoming so strong in the Western world, in North America, Western Europe, Japan, that is turning a whole generation against the kind of life this capitalist system delivers compared to what it promised, out of that contradiction, I suspect, will come the major impetus for worker co-ops.
Okay. I think this is the fundamental question that a lot of capitalist people who are looking into Marxism probably would ask, and I think it's probably one of the most important questions to ask. How can Marxism bring out the best in an individual?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I would be the first among Marxists, I assume, to be willing to say, to insist on saying, that the early experiments in having Marxists displace a capitalism and then trying to erect something in its place, whether we look at the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China or Vietnam or Cuba or Eastern Europe, etc., that those were initial experiments. That if you have a broad sweep of understanding of economic history, a subject that I have taught in my university life as a professor for many years, you will know that in the transition, for example, from slavery to feudalism or from feudalism to capitalism, there were many initial experiments in the new system. Many lasted only a few weeks, a few months, sometimes a few years. Then they fell apart because one or another of the conditions for them to succeed were not present or were not sufficiently developed. And it took a long time for the conditions to congeal that would allow a wholesale ending of slavery and or a wholesale ending of feudalism. And I am persuaded that the same is true of capitalism, and that the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China represented early efforts, remarkable for how much they did achieve, remarkable even more for how long they were able to last. Although if you go back earlier, you will quickly discover, for example, in 1870, there was something called the Paris Commune. It only lasted 3 or 4 months, but it was a model that Lenin later on went back to, just as in the future, people will learn from the mistakes and the correct moves that were made by earlier experiments so that later ones have a better chance. So as a Marxist, I would say we as Marxists have to be very self-critical. We have to be able to say, okay, what happened in the Soviet Union that made it turn in the direction it did? Why did Stalin and Stalinism happen? What mistakes were made? What decisions were made that shouldn't have been made? What decisions were not made that should have been made? That kind of searching self-criticism is necessary to avoid replicating the same tragedies that happened in our earlier experiments. And to bring it back to the issue of a co-op, for me, that has meant to the discovery and then the exploitation by my colleagues and I of the recognition that one thing that neither the Russians nor the Chinese nor the Cubans nor the Vietnamese did, although the Cubans are now trying in a very interesting way, but what they didn't do in those societies was to transform the workplace. They may have had the government come in and take over. They may have had the government substitute planning for markets.
Yeah.
But when it came to the organization of the workplace, they basically replaced the board of directors elected by shareholders with state officials brought in by the political party or the government. And for the average worker, this didn't mean the kind of transformation that I think Marxism is all about. The democratization of the workplace, having the workers actually take over. I mean, there's an old slogan somewhere in Marx that if you want an economic system to serve the people, you have to put the people in charge. And that means in charge of every enterprise that produces the goods and services we depend on. So for me, the self-criticism of Marxism, the way to make it once again have that power of inspiration and motivation that it once had, would be to honestly face what went wrong in the early experiments to apply it, and to show that the next phase, the 21st century version of socialism, will be quite different, will have as its centerpiece the transformation of the workplace into a democratically run community, and that is a very profound non-capitalist transformation that will give the meaning of, quote, revolution, or the meaning of a social change of your social system, the kind of immediacy and concrete power that will make it possible to have a change in the world of the sort that people now increasingly want, but with the old socialism haven't a clear idea of where now to go.
Yeah. One of the things that I just noticed with what you said there is that there's a learning from failures. Do you think there potentially could be like a slight merging of capitalism and Marxism to really get the best out of the individual?
Yes, I think that I think that's going to happen whether we like it or want it or not. I don't believe in the notion that you bring to an end something in some cataclysmic final way.
Yeah.
My guess is that all kinds of dimensions of capitalism will live on in various forms well beyond the end of the system's social dominance. I mean, let me give you a simple example from feudalism. When a lord and a serf, usually in a Catholic medieval setting, swore to be loyal and honor one another, the serf to his lord, the lord to his serf, they used phrases like, each of us promises to love, honor, etc., the other. Well, if you know anything about the modern marriage ceremony in societies that long ago got rid of feudalism, it's literally the same words that are supposed to be uttered by husband and wife.
Yeah.
There's the way, I mean, it's a small example, but it's a way in which something from the preceding social system has lasted a very long time, indeed, deep in the heart of a new and different system. So my guess is that human beings, precisely because of the anxiety that always attends moving to something new, moving to something different, that human beings will work very hard to hold on to something they found meaningful in the society of the past and carry it forward with more or less in the way of modifications, because it has been something to which they've attached significance and meaning. And so, yes, I fully expect that whatever the cataclysmic failure of capitalism, of which, by the way, we've had already a foretaste in the recent past with the collapse of 2008, which is still shaping much of what's going on in the world, that when capitalism is finally pushed aside the way slavery and feudalism were before, that there will be all kinds of struggles and movements to combine these two systems, whatever the new one is, and what capitalism was or what people believe capitalism was good at that should be held on to. I don't find that worrisome or frightening at all. I think that's the normal way social change happens. It's not either cataclysmic or slow and gradual. It's both.
Yeah.
And the very pace and rhythm of that shifts with the circumstance.
Well, thank you very much for your time there, Professor Richard Wolff. I'll be in touch with you in the future. Is there anything you're working on at the moment?
Yes, I am most at work on precisely the issues that you've raised. In other words, I'm trying both to write and to speak about what it would mean to say that there is a new socialism for the 21st century that is radically different from what socialism has been in the past. It's not primarily about the government taking over or running the economy. It's not about public versus private enterprise so much, or planning versus markets so much, that it's rather focused on the transformation of the workplace.
Yeah.
That place where adults spend most of their lives, 5 out of mostly 7 days, most of the best hours of the day, that transforming that into a genuine, participatory, democratic activity has the potential to restructure society and get us closer to realizing the liberty, equality, and fraternity that have been the guideposts for progressive people since the French Revolution.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your time again. I'll be in touch, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. I would be very pleased to speak with you again in the future.
Thanks for making it through to the end. If you're interested in how the blockchain can turn money into social goods, check out the blockchain playlist on the Value of Everything YouTube channel. Also, you may be interested to hear my dialogues and debates with Michael Cunha, a council communist. Thanks again.